Hey everyone, on today's episode of the DOJO podcast, we've got Mike Bender back on the show. We're going to be talking about all kinds of stuff centered around networking in Microsoft Azure and more generally cloud platforms. And on top of that, we're also going to be talking about why it's important for modern day IT pros to learn these cloud networking skills. Coming up next on the DOJO podcast. Well, hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the DOJO podcast, the podcast designed to help you become the IT black belt within your organization. As always, my name is Andy Serwich. I'm the technical evangelist with Hornet Security and your host for the DOJO podcast. With me, I've got maybe a familiar face or familiar voice if you're listening to this in the car. I've got Mike Bender with us here today. How's it going, Mike?
Hey, great, Andy. Great to be on the podcast again.
Yeah, definitely. It's good to have you back. I think the last time we were on, we had you on, you were talking about PowerShell, which fantastic episode. You know, I've kind of done the post-processing on that, and that one came out really well. Those of you listening, hopefully you've had a chance to check that one out. If you haven't, I'll be sure to include that in the show notes beneath this video or, you know, in the show notes of the audio version, whichever one you're watching/listening to. But, you know, today, Mike, I think we're talking about, you know, just kind of the importance of, you know, virtual networking in the cloud, right? I think that's kind of what we've got on the docket for today. But before we get too far into that, real quick, before we get too far, let's quick do an introduction of you. That way people who may not be familiar with you kind of know who you are and what you do in the industry.
Well, okay, great. Well, for those of you that don't know who I am, my name is, again, Michael Bender. I am a principal author evangelist at Pluralsight, and that's a big, long, fancy name. And basically, I'm an internal author there. So I build content over there. I build video content. I also work on labs for our labs platform as well. And my focus is mostly certification based in the Azure realm. I've done some AWS labs. I've got a PowerShell course over there and some Windows Server stuff. So, you know, I've been working in the field of IT pros for a number of years, teaching, presenting, building content, you know, just really, you know, helping people skill up by, you know, trying to share my knowledge. So, you know, as always, I appreciate the opportunity to get on the mic with Andy and have a great conversation about technology.
Yeah, definitely. It's always great to have you on the show because we always have these interesting conversations about, you know, the IT industry and like you mentioned, skilling, like where should people be focusing their efforts? What should they be looking at? All that type of stuff, right? So I'm excited to talk about this particular topic today. And again, like I mentioned earlier, you know, we're kind of focusing on the importance of, you know, virtual networking skills, particularly in the cloud, right? And I think maybe one of the first things I feel like we should talk about is, again, why is it important? And I mean, when I think about cloud networking and whether or not I should learn it, I mean, my gut feeling is like, hey, it's becoming a cloud-first world. And just because of the disaggregated nature of cloud workloads, the user being here or the user being here or in a different country or at their house, I mean, that in and of itself makes networking more complicated, right? So I mean, those are some of my thoughts. So, you know, what do you think is some of the key takeaways when we talk about the importance of learning these cloud networking skills?
You know, I think what's important about it is that, you know, for so many of us, you know, we grew up learning how to subnet and, you know, maybe we did some Cisco stuff, or depending on where you went. In a lot of shops, the only people that touched the networking equipment were the network people. So the company that I worked for back in the day, we had an entire networking team. So they gave us the subnets. You know, we put up our DHCP servers, but they told us what the addresses were for the routers, and all of that was set up. So,
right,
you know, it was basically like, okay, plug this in here, it'll work.
right.
You know, for a lot of people on-prem, that's the way it is. And there was this networking function that did a lot of that. And I realize that's not necessarily the same for a lot of SMBs, some like small, medium-sized businesses. But when you get up into the cloud, it's not really like moving your routers and switches up into the cloud. It just like it's not like moving your servers into the cloud, or it's not like moving Active Directory. Azure AD is not Active Directory on-prem running in the
Right.
cloud. And that's a good thing to remember. With virtual networking, it's really you really have to have a greater understanding of networking as an IT pro when you're building solutions, because there are so many things connected to it. And I think that's the challenge with the cloud, is that you really have to have a broader idea of things. Where, we've talked about this in the past. I know plenty of people that all they ever did was Exchange Server, and that's what they did for
Right.
a long, long time. And you had a pretty good career just doing Exchange Server.
Yep.
But you can't just have a career these days just being like managing Exchange in the cloud. You got to deal with all of
Do
those
other
other things
stuff.
in Microsoft 365. The same with on the Azure side, is that there's a really good chance that, if you're dealing with virtual machines in Azure, you're also dealing with the networking pieces of it.
Yep.
And I think a really important part for people to understand, sure, we have this on-prem, is that our networking structures, our networks provide a security boundary of sorts. That sure will have some firewalls, and you set up routing to keep traffic here and here. In the cloud, it really is a huge part of security in the cloud.
Oh, yes. Yep.
So when you start building your subnets, nothing communicates until you tell it to, which is good, and by design we want that.
Right.
But what that requires of you, it's not plug and play like a lot of things were for many of us IT pros going into certain areas.
Very
Is
true.
that underlying networking structure, you really have to think about that, and you have to and it's one of those things where if you don't design it right in the first place, it may take a lot of hard work and some pain in order to get the proper thing working the way you want it. Just as if you do the wrong subnetting on-prem, if you give too few addresses, that causes pain and you have to do rework.
Yep.
Same in the cloud.
Yep.
But those are, the security and the really being more involved with the networking than most IT professionals may be comfortable with. So you absolutely need to understand subnets. So if you look at a site or address and can have a couple of addresses and know whether or not those overlap and how many addresses that encompasses and those sorts of things, if you can't do that, that may be a skill you might want to work
Yep.
on if you're doing some stuff where you're architecting your stuff in there. If you're simply somebody's already built the network for you and told you, hey, put this into this virtual network and this subnet, that's the one where you're going to put your VM and blah, blah, blah. Don't need to know as much. But for those of you that are, maybe you're a small business and you're looking to move some stuff into Azure and you need to build all of the stuff for you, you need to make sure that you understand those networking pieces to ensure that you don't overlap not only subnets up there, but most likely your on-prem stuff, because
Right.
there's probably a chance you're working in that hybrid network.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very common design that I've run into especially the last year or two, where there's some sort of either VPN or some sort of direct access up into their Azure resources. A lot of different options to get connected there, right? But I think one thing that you mentioned that I really kind of want to accentuate is the fact that so many IT pros are used to worrying about just the four walls of their building, right? Maybe they have another four walls, another state away, and a line between that they have to worry about. Point of the matter is they've had a boundaried area that's all they've had to worry about, right? Whereas, like you said, when you're deploying resources and workloads in the cloud, in Azure, in AWS, in any cloud platform, you really have to have maybe you don't need to be an expert in every specific area, but you have to be able to understand and put together the whole picture, right?
Yep. And you have to, I mean, especially if, like just for an example, let's say you've got an organization where you've got some branch offices and then you have you're a multi-region environment. So that means you have regions in different regions of Azure. Is
Right.
that if you were just going with the plain on-prem mindset, what did we do back in the day? You VPN between each of your
Yup.
branches.
Yep.
You can do that, but there are services that allow you to use the Azure backbone, like service endpoints and private endpoints, that depending on the service that you're running, allows you to use the backbone in Azure. So where you would think that, oh, I need to connect US West to US East, and so I'm going to do a site to site, which you absolutely can do. There's reasons why you might want to do that. But you have to understand that there's, different ways of looking at it. And so those things really don't come up in the on-prem world, unless for some reason you had private fiber between two branch offices.
Right.
But then,
Which private fiber,
that's going to be its own, that would be that's going to be pricey,
Yeah.
all of those things. So it just kind of goes back to the whole thing where you still have to spend a ton of time really thinking about it and really have an understanding of how not only the networking, but you have to know the networking, but you have to understand what you're trying to do from a business level. Are you using a managed SQL instance? Are you running a SQL in a VM? There's different options for how you connect to the networking, depend on the different services that you're running.
Right.
So there's a lot more there going on that I think from a knowledge standpoint, you just have to have you have to have a broader understanding of what's there. It doesn't mean you have to deeply understand all of these. You just really need to know what all of your options are,
Right.
so that you can make the best decisions when you're taking and whether it be moving to that hybrid or whether you're doing a migration up into Azure. That being able to look at all of those pieces and look at the business and use the power of the cloud. Because one of the things that I mentioned was the Azure backbone. So being able to send traffic not over the internet and not having to do a VPN between two places is actually a pretty cool benefit to have, of being able to go between data centers in Azure and it all being on that backbone
Right.
that Azure runs, provides you some advantages that you can have with your business. So, just have to really have a really good understanding across the board of, all of the things that you're playing with.
Yeah, I think like you said, I mean, when I look at networking, customers and end users, they hate that blanket IT answer of it depends, right? But what I feel like when it comes to networking, especially in the cloud, like it really does. It really depends, right? That's where I feel like that answer fits in the most. And I think Microsoft has done a really fantastic job in providing pretty much an option for any situation that I could ever think of. I mean, not only in Azure, but they've thought about that from the on-premise side of the equation as well, right? With things like Azure Network Adapter for Windows Server, just coming up with ways to be able to plug in Windows Server directly into Azure from the on-premises side. So I feel like they've given it a lot of thought in that in that regard. And I'm sure they've gotten a lot of telemetry and feedback that tell them that, hey, people are wanting these options. Because I mean, let's face it, Microsoft doesn't build stuff for no reason at all, right? But yeah, that's that's one of my favorite things about networking in Azure is just the array of different options and capabilities. And I think one of the things that you've been kind of working with quite a bit lately in Azure networking, Mike, is vWAN, right? I think you've been doing some stuff with vWAN lately.
I've been, as much as anybody can, just kind of, put my toe in the water and, checking it out because we've got some content that we're working on. One of my fellow authors is working on an amazing course on AZ700, which covers the new Azure network certification, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And I'm working on some labs that are associated with it. So I've been, really kind of skilling up on, just deepening my learning on the networking. So, the Azure Virtual WAN is actually kind of because sometimes you look at some cloud products, you're like, that is a product that's looking for a solution or a solution that's looking for a problem.
Right.
And, with Virtual WAN, I first came across it when I was at Microsoft and we were talking about it on tour and talking to people presenting on it. And I'm like, at that time, it really wasn't as like, it was more kind of just like a marketing sort of thing. It was just like, okay,
right.
Yeah, we kind of need to do this. But it's matured, over the last few years, and it really provides a great option for those organizations that have multiple network connections in a hybrid scenario with Azure. So basically what it allows you to do is you think of it as a wide area network, but instead of connecting your on-prem data centers that are different geographic regions, this allows you to connect your different Azure regions together. It allows you to connect your on-premises resources. That could be a site-to-site VPN connection. It could be express route if you're using the private connections.
Yep.
It could be point-to-site connections. So for many of those organizations where many of your users have moved home, but you still want them to have a secure connection because maybe you've deployed your applications into Azure and they need to connect in to get to that application or resources or whatever it is. It allows you to bring all of those different pieces together.
Right.
Because in the on-prem world, if you started talking about, I need a private fiber, which is kind of like what ExpressRoute is.
Right.
And then I need to run a VPN that's going over the public internet. And now you want to connect clients in. How many different network devices do you have to put into your network and configure those and try to get them to work? It's a lot of stuff going on.
Is.
And then say you got to do so it may not, I haven't kicked the tires enough on it to really find out what the limitations are. You go read the docs at docs@microsoft.com, dive into it. There's probably a list of things. Here's the things you can do. Here's the things you can't. And chances are usually the way Microsoft is if it's a product that they're really moving forward with, that usually that list of can't just kind of gets ticked off over time. And
right.
It's not a matter of it's never going to do that. It's just they haven't gotten to that piece yet. And there's a lot of times those things that, that they can't do on it that it'll allow you to do at some point in the future. So it might not be the option for everyone, but like things in the cloud, it depends. There's a lot of different solutions for a lot of different people, and there's no cookie cutter solution for anyone. So I think if you find yourself where your organization, any of those, if you have multiples of those things that I mentioned that you need to try to figure out how to network together, it might be worth taking a look at the Azure vWANs to see if maybe that would allow you to better manage and get a better handle on how do you get all those connections together.
Right. To at the very least simplify things, right? So, because I mean, like you mentioned earlier, if I was going to go the third party route for, a lot of the stuff you mentioned, I'm looking at an appliance for this, a software service over here for this, firewall rules here, firewall rules there, client-side software. When you think about all the different components that are in play there, I have to install, manage, support. I have to pay for hardware maintenance if it's some sort of an appliance. It's just a whole ball of wax. Whereas, if I can get all that through Azure vWAN, great. Where do I sign up, right? I will take a single tool that does it all over a plethora of different tools if given the choice, and all things being equal, right? So,
yeah.
Yeah, I know I deployed Azure vWAN once or twice, and again, same situation, kind of in lab settings, right? I mean, there's a lot to it, and one thing that kind of threw me for a loop when I was deploying it for the first time was, you run through the wizard, you fill out all your settings, you hit deploy, and it's like, okay, come back in half an hour and it'll be ready. And I mean, most Azure services, when you deploy them, don't say that, right? But it actually is like, okay, we estimate it'll be about 30 minutes. I mean, that's in part because of all the underlying services and all of the, the associated components that are getting deployed under the hood, right? But yeah, I mean, it's very expansive, and like you said, can do a lot from what I've seen. So,
yeah.
Well, cool stuff. I think what we're gonna have to do is, if there's enough interest for listeners, be sure to leave us comments, hit us up on social media. If you'd like kind of a deep dive on anything vWAN related, let us know. I do know we have, I think, 3 articles out on the Altero blogs that cover Azure Virtual WAN. Some of them are kind of hey, what is vWAN? This is what it does. These are some of the options you can do with it. But we also have some more comparison type articles as well. So I'll be sure to link those in the show description as well, in case anyone wants to go take a look at those. So I guess I think we kind of answered this question. I just want to make sure we kind of circle back to it. And that is, how does it fit into the larger cloud networking picture? And I mean, if I was going to answer that question, if somebody asked me on the street and that was, how does it fit? I would say it's kind of your central network, right? If you're like you said, a multi-office organization. I mean, really, I only see, your larger SMEs and your enterprises of the world needing this level of complexity, right? But really, like you said, it brings all those different tools and components together, right?
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, we've talked about a lot of networking stuff so far, right, Mike? And I know your big area of expertise is certification, skilling, getting people trained up. I want to circle back to kind of the 101 level stuff in terms of cloud networking. If I am, a newer IT pro, maybe I've been in the industry for a year, maybe I'm a junior administrator somewhere or a level 1 help desk technician, fairly new to the industry, what would be some good resources, or how would you suggest I get started in learning more about the basics of networking in Azure?
So, I always, the first place I tell everybody to go, because it's free and because it is whether you're studying for certification or whether you want best practices or whatever it is going right to the source. So checking out docs.microsoft.com. So just do a quick search, just go out to docs. You can actually put in docs.com and it'll self go to that. So to kind of a short link. Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that.
Unless they broke it again. So we better check that out before we publish this. But going out to docs and just checking out the articles. So if you wanted to know more about virtual networking, you could check that out there. They do a great rundown of virtual networking and how it works. If you go into the Azure section, There's a section on networking and just really going in there. Along with that, a part of that is Microsoft Learn has a platform. And I know that they do have some content that they've been rolling out on virtual networking. And some of it aligns with their new certification that they're rolling out, which is the AZ700, which is the Microsoft Certified Network Engineer in Azure. So that is a completely networking focused. And I took the beta a couple weeks ago, and it was something. There was a lot to it. I mean,
remember.
you really have to know your stuff on the networking level. I mean, to the level of knowing the different SKUs of like what's going to provide you the services that you need for this and this. And so it's you're like, oh, networking. Oh, it's just like ones and zeros. And no, there's so much going on with, application gateways and, the Azure firewall and
Right.
all of that sort of stuff. So, check out Microsoft Learn. As I mentioned, my good friend and colleague, Tim Warner, is working on a great course over Pluralsight on the AZ700. And I'm guessing by the time that this airs, is he will have those available for you if you do have a Pluralsight subscription. But along with any of those, whatever resource you're taking, get into Azure and start playing around with it.
Yep.
To deploy something out there and get it to work, and then be like, okay, I need to lock that down. How do I manage it? I mean, I can tell you from experience that you do not use RDP open all the time in Azure because there are bots that literally sit waiting for that to come online. So I was doing, back when I was at Microsoft, I was doing a presentation on security stuff and on Security Center. And I just pulled some things up just for the heck of it to see what happens when you bring a VM online with RDP open. And within about an hour, Security Center was filled with people attempting to break into my virtual machine. So there's so much that you can do from the networking side, whether it be things like Azure Bastion that would allow you to do that RDP into your environment securely.
It's a cool product.
Or using the Azure firewall in place of a traditional application firewall. You can still do your, like if there are some things I was having this discussion this weekend with one of my friends, and, they were using Azure Firewall and they decided to move back to another thing, basically standing up 3 appliances in Azure. I can't remember which one they were using, but it was because Azure Firewall, 1, the price on it was a little bit higher than they were looking, and 2, it didn't give quite all the functionality that they were looking at. So, play around in there. The one thing you always want to remember is, this is my big tip for when you're playing around in Azure. Build everything in a single resource group. That way, when you're done with it, you can delete the resource group, and it should delete everything that you had. That way, you're not worried about paying for it. Because I've had problems in AWS where I just couldn't find things that I had turned on because it really wasn't all tied together.
Right.
I will tell you that, when you start getting into some services that are not resource level resources, maybe it's a certificate service or some other things, you may run into some things in Azure that it might say, oh, hey, you can't delete that because such and such is attached. But at least it tells you need to detach these things and then go about that. But I always recommend build everything in a resource group. That way you can see what's running, you see what you've got deployed, and when you're ready to shut it down, you can delete and get rid of everything, because you're gonna run up some bills, especially if you turn on firewall and like a VPN gateway and sort of that stuff. Don't come talk to me and Andy when you got a $1,000 bill because you forgot about that stuff that you did 6 weeks ago, and Microsoft charges your card. Just be really cognizant of that. That's one of the things with learning in the cloud that can be kind of dicey, is that,
Yeah.
as soon as you turn the stuff on, the meter's running. It's just like a cab. You get in the cab, they start the meter. And
It's
so just make sure you keep your eye on that. And that's a really great way to take that learning that you've gotten from either videos or from the documentation, and taking that learning and just really, connecting your brain to it by doing that hands-on with it, by getting those multiple modalities from a teaching aspect and a learning aspect. For most of us, that really helps us to be able to really have an understanding of it.
definitely. It's funny you mentioned the cost aspect of it. I came across a Reddit post. It was a couple of weeks ago now, where somebody had accidentally left on an M series VM with no auto shutdown enabled, and
Eek.
end of the month showed up, and they M series, for those that aren't aware, stands for monster sized VM. Their bill was like 60 grand larger than it normally is, or something insane like that, and it was just like,
Yeah.
oops.
Oops.
That's a
Yeah.
big oops.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
and then circling back to what you followed that up with, in that, kind of wrapping your head around it, getting your hands on it. I found that what works well for new people learning networking in Azure, what I would always suggest to them, just to kind of wrap your head around how the networking layer works in Azure, is deploy a VM using the wizard, and then go in and manually nuke the external IP, the network security group, and the NIC for the VM, and then rebuild it from scratch by adding those individual objects. Because I found that's just kind of a good exercise to kind of, one, learn how to do it, and two, to kind of wrap your head around how all the interconnecting pieces work between all those components, right?
Yeah. I also found that, kind of like a interesting with this as well, is that we were doing some lab stuff, and I was using a lot of, it was my first foray into working with Terraform,
Hmm.
because that's what we use to build up environments in our labs environment. And I found when I broke things down into code, so this would work if you're using Azure CLI, if you're using Azure PowerShell, if you're using ARM templates, the Azure Resource Manager templates, is that when you start looking at it at the code level, it breaks it down into the individual pieces. So when you created that virtual machine, yes, you went through each of those different tabs and did that. But in the back end, it's just like on-prem when you do stuff with the server, that the nice GUI thing does all the things in the back end.
Right.
Oftentimes when you do it from the code side, or like what you did, build those manually, which you can absolutely do, when you're building infrastructure as code with you know, you really have to have that understanding. And for me, when I started working with Terraform, it really helped me to really understand how all of those different pieces work together, especially on the networking side,
Right.
because I'm like, why is this stuff not working? Why can't I get through, you know, with all the security groups and the
Yep.
application groups and all of those, that you really had to have a deep understanding of how everything connects together. So I think that's super helpful.
Yeah, and then if you really want to cook your brain in abstraction, start doing nested virtualization in Azure, because then you have the Azure networking layer, you have your hypervisor sitting on top of it, which then you have to handle. You have to basically set up a bridged network device in order for the nested VMs to get out to the Azure Fabric, and I had to do that for an Azure Stack HCI demo I was doing a couple weeks back. And I've done this, I've set up labs hundreds of times, but I remember I was getting into it's an inception situation, right? Which layer of virtualization am I currently in, right?
Yeah.
And it becomes interesting to try and keep track of all that, definitely. So on a side note, I just punched in docs.com into my browser, and it worked. So it's still working.
Awesome.
So Fantastic. Let's see. Going through my list here of other things, we talked about the certification. So AZ700. Yeah, I saw your tweet on that. Yeah, I remember looking at your tweet and being like, "Oh, this sounds like it's pretty rough."
It was it was it was one of those that I was half prepared for it, and I took it I took it kind of I will take exams to take them. I always want to pass, and I always try to put a pretty good effort into it, but it
Right.
just happened to be where it kind of fell. I couldn't put 130% into it because actually nobody actually had courses or anything for me to do. So I basically had to kind of go off the the guide and just kind of dig into some different areas. So, I kind of went into it kind of okay, if I end up passing in the beta, then I pass. If I don't, I might take it at a later time. I enjoyed the exam. I enjoyed the stuff, but it definitely was. I mean, you know, if somebody's thinking that, oh, this is just like a step up from, it's a couple step up from the level of networking you need to know at AZ 104. It's pretty substantial of what you need. And I think it might even go beyond engineer level, that it might be architect level
Got it.
in what's in there. But, it's definitely not insurmountable. And I think it's a good certification if, let's say, you're one of those on-prem people, the networking has been your thing,
Right.
and you're looking, okay, where do I move next in my career? That if you're moving your organization into the cloud, AZ700 is probably a good certification area for you to look into. Because if you're the on-prem network engineer, network architect, you have to understand all of the application gateways and the web application firewalls and the Azure firewall and all of that stuff, and private
Right.
endpoints and service endpoints and how VNets work and VNet peering and blah, 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 and hybrid connectivity. So you have to understand all of that, because chances are that's what your company needs in order to move forward. They're not going to go to the Joe Schmo server exchange guy that is running Microsoft 365 and go, hey, how do we get our branch offices connected? They're going to you. So
Yep.
for those of you that are in your position, you're wondering, okay, how do I, one, get that knowledge, but also, maybe step up my career a little bit? Take a look at AZ 700 and maybe use that as a catalyst for, doing some stuff you can use not only in your org, but also moving your career forward.
That's good advice. I mean, what you explained earlier was kind of my experience as well. I was always the storage and virtualization guy, and we had a separate network operations team that they just did all the layer 3 and the layer 2 stuff inside of our data center. So when I would, install a new hypervisor into our cloud platform, I'd say, "Hey guys, I need 8 switch ports and 2 fiber ports or whatever." And they'd be like, okay, rack 17, row 8, ports 3, 5, and 7, and you need to use VLAN ID 10 or whatever, and it was like you said, it was just kind of always like, okay, they set that piece up, I plug in my server and it works, right? So I always say I was kind of spoiled by that, but at the same time, it leaves a little bit of a knowledge gap too. So, but I'm glad we were able to cover kind of both angles in this particular episode. For those that were more on the infrastructure side, but also like you mentioned, AZ700 might be a good option for those people that are, on that internal network operations team, definitely. So. And then I kind of want to wrap up with one other thing. Something you said earlier made me think of this, Mike, and this might be a little bit of a curveball, but when you look at networking in Azure, let's say I go out, I learn how to do networking in Azure. You mentioned AWS earlier, and in your experience with AWS, how much knowledge would you say transfers between clouds? You know what I mean? If I go and learn networking in Azure, I would imagine I would at least have a basic understanding of how the core concepts work on the AWS side, but I can't imagine it's all that different. I say that being fairly ignorant of AWS as a cloud platform, because I'm strictly a Microsoft guy for the most part.
Yeah, I think you're going to find from, conceptually the concept of virtual networking that, your knowledge is going to transfer over to AWS. So it's not going to be like you're scratching your head
Right.
and going, you know, it's not going to be a head scratcher of going from like Azure where you're using Azure AD to using IAM over in AWS,
Right.
where people that are born in AWS and they go to Azure and they can't figure out how to do anything with identity because of the way Azure AD works.
Vastly
And
different.
that, so it's not going to be like that. So if you're in AWS, if you're in Azure and then you're like, hey, got to do some stuff in AWS, maybe you're multi-cloud, maybe you join a new organization. That's one of those areas where, just some quick refresher is really going to bring you up to speed and understanding it. Because what it's going to come down to fundamentally is, routing traffic between the different resources and those sorts of things. So the same thing that you're doing in Azure is the same thing you're doing over in AWS. You still have to look about it the same way. What's the best way to get connectivity to my resources? The big difference is that AWS is more cloud native,
Right.
meaning that they're more of organizations being point to site connecting directly to them. Whereas on the Azure side, you're often dealing with larger enterprises. Not that larger enterprises aren't connecting in AWS, they absolutely can. It's just one of those things I found that being an old school Microsoft IT pro, that on-prem and then moving to hybrid mindset that's pretty prevalent now with Azure.
Yep.
Between the enterprise and going up in Azure, wasn't the first thing they thought about when they built AWS, and still they're I think that's an area that they're kind of lagging behind, and why you're seeing such an uptick in Azure is that enterprises are coming online that, I'll be a fanboy here. If you had an organization and you're running Active Directory on-prem, not sure why you're looking at AWS
Right.
unless you have a bunch of shadow IT that's already been deployed to AWS, and that's what you have to use.
Which that's a whole nother problem in and of itself.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation.
Yep.
But yeah, a lot of things I think, expanding and just finish it off. A lot of things that you'll learn in one cloud, the fundamental knowledge and how the stuff works is going to transfer over. You're going to get into the different features and the different subsets, and
Right.
like identity is completely different between the both two. So don't even try to bring your AWS knowledge over to Azure. You need to just learn from the ground up how role-based access control works, how
Yep.
Azure AD does identity, and forget about what you did over in AWS. Same going over. Don't bring that stuff with you. Actually, you can kind of bring the RBAC stuff with you, but it's done way different.
Way differently.
So,
makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, very cool. I think we talked about a lot of stuff, a lot of great information. I always appreciate having you on the show, Mike. For those people that may have follow-up questions, how can people reach you after the show?
So, the easiest way to hit me up is on Twitter. I am at Michael Bender, and I'm sure Andy will put that in the show notes as well.
Yep, sure will.
And, maybe what Andy can do is if, you can leave a question. Can they leave questions below?
That depends on the platform. I think when we post the video version on YouTube, I think there'll be comments in the YouTube section. So we could leave them there.
Yep.
So yeah,
probably
you can do that
Twitter.
as well.
Twitter's the best place. And maybe some other stuff will turn up by the next time we talk about places we can talk.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds good. Well, Mike, I appreciate you coming on the show. We'll definitely have to have you back again. It's always good having you on. And for those of you watching, appreciate you watching or listening, depending on the platform that you're consuming this on. Also, be sure to check out our DOJO platform. We've got all kinds of fantastic content out there. We've got Hyper-V content, VMware, service provider specific content, backup DR, M365, Azure. It's getting easier to say what we don't cover than it is to say what we do. If you're interested in checking that out, you can always go to www.altero.com/dojo. That'll get you to the main page, and then you can choose your poison from there. Other than that, again, like Mike mentioned, I'll be sure to get our social media handles on the show notes here so you guys can have quick access to that. Other than that, Mike, thanks for showing up again. Always good having you. Folks, thanks for watching and listening, and we'll catch you again for a future episode of the Dojo Podcast. See you later. Hey everyone, it's Andy again. Hey, thanks for watching the episode today. Hope you enjoyed it. One thing I wanted to leave you with, we've been talking a lot about Azure Stack HCI, Hyper-V, hybrid cloud, and a lot of the recent episodes. Wanted to let you know that on March 23rd, we are running a webinar that talks about all things Azure Stack HCI and hybrid cloud. Now, you can register for that webinar by clicking on the link in the description of this episode. And if you're watching or listening to this episode after March 23rd, you can use that same link to watch the webinar on demand. So hope you enjoy it. Again, we hope to see you for a future episode of the podcast. Have a great day.